Welcome to Intel Focus, the review series. We're diving into Factfulness today,
Ah.
a book by Hans Rosling, this renowned global health expert.
It's really interesting how Rosling kicks off the book. Um, Instead of just laying out his ideas right away, he kind of throws a quiz at you.
Okay.
13 questions about global trends. These big picture things that we think we should know about.
Like what kind of topics are we talking?
Well, things like poverty, health, and population.
Makes sense.
But get this, the results are pretty shocking.
Shocking in what way?
Most people, even, these highly educated experts, they score terribly.
Wow, that's pretty humbling.
It is. It's a real wake-up call that our gut feelings about the world can be way off.
Yeah, we think we know, but we really don't.
Exactly. And Rosling argues that this isn't just random guessing. It's a systematic error in how we think.
So there's a pattern to our wrongness.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He calls these hardwired tendencies dramatic instincts. And they basically distort our worldview.
Can you give me an example?
Sure. Take the gap instinct, for example. It makes us see the world in these binary categories like developed versus developing countries.
So we oversimplify things.
Yeah, we see this huge gap where there's actually a more nuanced spectrum.
Gotcha. So that leads to all sorts of misconceptions.
Right. Rosling dismantles this outdated two-box model using data.
What does he suggest instead?
He introduces the concept of 4 income levels.
4 income levels?
Yeah, and it highlights how most people don't fit neatly into those extreme categories we were talking about before.
So that's a much more realistic picture than what we often see like on the news or something?
Much more realistic, and this is where the power of factfulness really comes in. It helps us challenge those ingrained assumptions and see the world based on data and evidence.
So it's about upgrading our mental software.
Precisely, and when we do that, it reveals a surprising trend.
Which is?
The world, despite all its problems, is actually getting better.
Huh. That seems counterintuitive with all the negative news we hear all the time.
It does, right? It's almost like our brains are wired to focus on the bad stuff.
Yeah, it can feel that way sometimes.
That's what Rosling calls the negativity instinct, one of the 10 dramatic instincts he identifies.
So we're predisposed to negativity.
In a way, yes, but he uses all these compelling charts and statistics to show how life expectancy has gone up, child mortality has gone down, and extreme poverty has been drastically reduced.
Especially, I imagine, in the last few decades.
Yes, especially in the last 20 years.
Those improvements are staggering. So if the world is getting better, why don't we see it that way?
Well, think about it. Good news rarely makes headlines, right? It's the negative events that capture our attention and shape our perception.
True. When was the last time you saw a headline about a country lifting itself out of poverty?
Exactly. It's those crises and conflicts that dominate the news cycle.
So how do we rewire our thinking to see beyond this negativity bias and get a more fact-based view?
Rosling offers a bunch of strategies. He encourages us to question our assumptions, dig deeper into the data, and consider alternative perspectives.
It sounds like he wants us to be more like investigators, not just passive consumers of information.
Absolutely. He wants us to be critical thinkers. And Rosling doesn't just preach this from an ivory tower. He brings these concepts to life with incredible anecdotes from his own life and career.
I was going to say, he's been on the front lines, right?
He has. He's fought Ebola outbreaks, investigated mysterious paralytic diseases, and even encountered surprising cultural misunderstandings while working in different countries.
Those stories probably make the book really come alive.
They do. They make it relatable and drive home the points he's making.
I read about that experience he had in Mozambique, where he was investigating that paralytic disease called Konzo.
Right.
The villagers there were initially skeptical of his presence and his research.
He had to build trust and explain his purpose in a way that resonated with their cultural understanding.
It wasn't just about scientific knowledge.
No, it was about cultural sensitivity, too.
Yeah.
Understanding the local context. That experience shows the importance of humility and open-mindedness when approaching global issues.
Solutions often require listening to and learning from people with different lived experiences.
Absolutely. And Rosling also tells this amazing story about encountering a group of capital managers in Edinburgh. He was tasked with explaining investment opportunities in Africa, a region that many viewed through a lens of pessimism and hopelessness.
That sounds like a tough crowd.
It was a classic case of what he calls the destiny instinct at play.
The destiny instinct.
Yeah, the belief that certain places or people are just destined to remain trapped in their current circumstances.
Right, so he had to challenge that.
Exactly. So he presented them with all this data-driven evidence, demonstrating that many African countries were experiencing rapid social and economic progress.
So he challenged their static worldview with dynamic evidence.
Exactly. And while his presentation was seemingly well received, there was this interesting interaction afterward that kind of shook him. A woman approached him, and while praising his presentation style, she criticized his vision. She felt he lacked ambition.
Wait, he just laid out a plan for tackling poverty in Africa within 20 years, and she's saying he lacked ambition.
I know, right? It was a fascinating encounter.
What did she say?
She explained that ending poverty was just the starting point. Her vision was much grander. She wanted to see a future where Africans would be welcomed as tourists in Europe, not viewed as unwanted refugees.
Wow, that's a powerful perspective.
It really underscores the importance of expanding our vision and recognizing that progress is a continuous journey.
It's not a finish line, it's a direction.
Exactly. That encounter for Rosling became a reminder to constantly question his own worldview and be open to perspectives that challenge his own, no matter how accomplished he became.
That's a valuable lesson for all of us. Now let's delve deeper into that gap instinct we talked about earlier. Rosling argues this instinct can lead to misleading generalizations and stereotypes.
Right. He highlights the outdated labels of developed and developing countries as a prime example. He argues those terms are no longer accurate in a world where most people live on levels 2 and 3 of his 4-income level model.
I'm starting to see how those 4 levels paint a much more nuanced picture.
Exactly. He uses the analogy of looking down from a skyscraper.
Okay.
From that height, it's hard to distinguish the height differences between buildings closer to the ground.
That's a good analogy. Like, our perspective can distort our understanding of reality.
Exactly. We often focus on the extremes while overlooking the vast middle ground where most people's lives are actually lived.
So how do we overcome this gap instinct? What does Rosling suggest?
Well, he encourages us to compare and divide.
Compare and divide.
Yeah, when we encounter a single number, we need to see context, compare it to other numbers, historical trends, different regions.
Always look for the bigger picture.
Exactly, and
Yeah.
always consider the denominator, what population or group that number represents.
Don't just focus on the numerator.
Right, it's like zooming out to get the full picture rather than fixating on a single data point.
Okay, I like that.
Rosling also emphasizes the importance of recognizing differences within groups and similarities across groups.
So like not lumping everyone into one big category.
Right. Broad categories can be very misleading. We need to look for the nuances and variations within them.
For instance, lumping all of Africa into one category ignores its incredible diversity.
Precisely. And conversely, there are often more similarities between people on the same income level, regardless of their geography or culture, than between people from the same country, but vastly different income levels.
That's interesting. So income level can be a more powerful unifier than national identity or cultural stereotypes.
Precisely. Rosling even uses the example of cooking pots.
Cooking pots.
Yeah, families on level 2, whether they're in Nigeria or China, may use similar pots and heating methods because their income level dictates their options, not their cultural traditions.
That's a fascinating insight.
Yeah.
It reminds us to look for those human connections that transcend borders and cultural differences.
Exactly. Now let's move on to another powerful instinct that Rosling unpacks, the destiny instinct. This is the idea that things are predetermined, that cultures are unchanging, and that progress is impossible for certain groups.
So it's like we're clinging to outdated narratives about different cultures and countries, assuming they're stuck in time.
Precisely. Rosling challenges this instinct by showcasing the dramatic transformations that have occurred in recent decades.
Okay.
He argues that societies and cultures are constantly evolving and adapting. Look at the dramatic decline in babies per woman globally.
What's the trend there?
When he was born, the average was 5 today. It's just below 2.5.
Wow, that's a remarkable shift.
It is. It shows that societies are not static entities frozen in time.
So things can change.
They can. And he emphasizes that progress is possible, even in places that seem stuck in poverty or conflict.
That's encouraging. So how do we challenge this destiny instinct? What are some practical things we can do?
Rosling suggests actively collecting examples of cultural change, constantly updating our knowledge, and talking to older people who've actually witnessed these transformations firsthand.
That's a great idea.
Yeah.
It's like tapping into living history books to understand how much things can change within a single lifetime.
Exactly. He uses the example of changing attitudes towards homosexuality in the United States.
Right.
In just a few decades, support for same-sex marriage has skyrocketed, demonstrating that even deeply ingrained cultural attitudes can evolve quickly.
It shows we shouldn't underestimate the potential for positive change.
Absolutely. Now, Rosling also delves into the dangers of the single perspective instinct.
The single perspective instinct.
Yeah, it's the tendency to explain complex issues with a single cause or solution.
Yeah.
This instinct is often fueled by ideology or a desire for simple answers to complex problems.
It's like pointing fingers, playing the blame game without considering all the factors involved.
Exactly. He uses the example of blaming pharmaceutical companies for not doing enough research on diseases that mainly affect poor populations. While there's definitely a need for more investment in that kind of research, just blaming the companies doesn't actually lead to effective solutions.
That oversimplifies the issue.
It does. Rosling argues for a more nuanced understanding. Moving beyond blame and seeking a deeper understanding of all the factors contributing to complex problems.
So it's about looking at the bigger picture.
Exactly. He encourages us to look for multiple perspectives, consider historical and economic contexts, and be wary of overly simplistic solutions.
So no magic bullets.
Right. He uses this thought-provoking analogy, a magic washing machine.
A magic washing machine.
Yeah, even with all the resources and good intentions, a pharmaceutical company can't just wash away a disease without understanding the complex web of factors contributing to its spread.
Right. It's not as simple as just throwing money at the problem.
It's about recognizing that real-world problems rarely have easy answers or quick fixes.
I see. And sometimes those solutions can come from unexpected places.
Right. Rosling shares a story about his quest to uncover the cause of that paralytic disease in Mozambique. He initially thought they were eating something new.
But it turned out to be something old.
Exactly. They were eating cassava, but in a different way because of economic pressures.
Because the government was buying processed cassava at high prices, farmers were selling their processed food and eating the unprocessed roots, which turned out to be toxic.
It's a stark example of how economic factors can have these unintended consequences on health and well-being.
And it emphasizes the importance of investigating root causes.
Absolutely. Understanding the interconnectedness of social, economic, and health issues.
It's a reminder that seeking scapegoats often prevents us from finding real sustainable solutions.
Now let's discuss another instinct that can lead us astray, the urgency instinct. This is our tendency to react impulsively to perceived threats, often without considering the full context or data.
Okay, so it's like our fight or flight response kicking in, even when the situation doesn't require it.
Exactly, and this instinct is often exploited by people trying to manipulate us.
Like salespeople pushing limited time offers.
Or activists using scare tactics.
Right.
Rosling encourages us to resist this urge to act impulsively. He wants us to take a step back, analyze the data, and consider the long-term consequences.
Just don't panic.
Exactly. He reminds us that we almost always have time to gather information, consult experts, and make informed decisions.
It's rarely a now or never situation.
Right. He uses the example of the Ebola outbreak in West Africa.
Okay.
He initially underestimated its severity, but when he saw the data revealing its exponential growth, he recognized the urgency.
Yeah.
But even in that crisis, he advocated for a data-driven approach.
He stayed calm and collected.
He did. He worked tirelessly with his team at Gapminder to analyze the data, communicate the urgency, and emphasize the need to understand the cultural context while working with local communities to implement effective strategies.
So it's about finding that balance between urgency and a clear-headed approach.
Exactly. Now let's talk about the generalization instinct, this tendency to make sweeping assumptions about entire groups based on limited information or anecdotal evidence.
Oh, yeah, it's easy to fall into that trap.
It is. This instinct can be incredibly damaging, leading to harmful stereotypes and prejudices, as well as inaccurate understandings of the world.
It's essential to remember that every group, every culture, every country has its own internal variations and complexities.
Absolutely. Rosling illustrates this with a rather humorous anecdote. While lecturing in the Democratic Republic of Congo, he was offered roasted termites, a local delicacy.
Roasted termites?
Yeah, his colleague who had lived there before readily accepted, but Rosling politely declined.
I can understand that.
He explained to the villagers that in his culture, eating termites was taboo, even pointing to a map to emphasize the geographical and cultural differences between himself and his termite-loving colleague.
So it's a funny story, but it carries a serious message.
It does. It's about challenging our assumptions and recognizing the diversity within and across cultures.
Right, and it reminds us that our own experiences, especially those from a privileged perspective, aren't always representative of the wider world.
Precisely. Now let's turn our attention to another instinct that can distort our worldview, the blame instinct. This tendency to point fingers and assign fault can actually hinder us from finding effective solutions and can even perpetuate harmful stereotypes.
It's often easier to find someone to blame than to actually deal with the complexity of the problem.
Precisely. Rosling highlights the example of a student who, frustrated by the lack of research on malaria, suggested punching in the face the boss of a pharmaceutical company.
Punching them in the face, that's a bit extreme.
It is, but it speaks to the raw emotion this instinct can evoke.
Yeah.
Rosling, who was about to give a lecture at that very company, challenged the student to think about the practicality and effectiveness of that action. Who exactly should be punched? And what would it actually achieve?
It's a good point. It's about moving beyond emotional responses and engaging in critical thinking about how to create real change.
Exactly. Later, Rosling visited that pharmaceutical factory and discovered they were actually producing anti-malarial drugs at a remarkably low cost, thanks to automation and efficient processes.
So the blame was misplaced.
It was. The anecdote underscores the importance of understanding the complexities of systems and industries before jumping to conclusions.
It's about seeking solutions, not scapegoats.
Exactly. And this also applies to the common tendency to blame the West for global problems, particularly climate change.
Right.
This simplistic narrative ignores the historical context and the current realities of global emissions.
So it's not that simple.
It's not. Rosling emphasizes that while developed countries bear responsibility for their historical emissions, it's crucial to acknowledge that developing countries are rapidly increasing their emissions as they industrialize and strive to improve their own living standards.
So it's a shared responsibility, not a blame game.
Precisely. Rosling advocates for global cooperation and innovative solutions rather than finger-pointing.
Okay, that makes sense. And he also cautions against the fear instinct, which can cloud our judgment and lead to misplaced priorities.
Right. Our brains are wired to respond to perceived threats, even if those threats are statistically unlikely.
It's like our survival mechanism kicking in.
Exactly. And the media often capitalizes on this, highlighting dramatic and frightening events, even if they are relatively rare.
It's that if it bleeds, it leads mentality.
Exactly. And this can create a distorted perception of risk where we overestimate the likelihood of rare occurrences like terrorist attacks while underestimating more common dangers like car accidents or preventable diseases.
We're afraid of the wrong things.
In a way, yes. So how do we keep the fear instinct in check? Rosling suggests grounding ourselves in facts, understanding the statistical likelihood of different threats.
So educate ourselves.
Yes, and he urges us to put risks in perspective by comparing them and focusing on addressing the most significant dangers, not the most sensationalized ones.
Don't let fear dictate your priorities or distort your understanding of true risks.
Exactly. He reminds us that the world in many ways is actually becoming safer. While challenges remain, violence, disease, and poverty are overall on a downward trend globally.
That's a message of hope, not complacency.
Exactly. It's about acknowledging the progress we've made while continuing to work toward addressing the remaining challenges. It's not cure. Rosling emphasizes that while developed countries bear responsibility for their historical emissions, it's crucial to acknowledge that developing countries are rapidly increasing their emissions as they industrialize and strive to improve their own living standards.
It's a complex issue with multiple contributing factors.
It is, and focusing blame on individuals can distract us from the need for systemic solutions.
So it's not about individual choices as much as it's about transforming energy systems, reducing deforestation, and promoting sustainable consumption patterns.
Exactly. He emphasizes the need for collective action and global cooperation to address climate change effectively.
He also cautions against the fear instinct, which can cloud our judgment and lead to misplaced priorities.
Our brains are wired to respond to perceived threats, even if those threats are statistically unlikely. The media often capitalizes on this, highlighting dramatic and frightening events, even if they are relatively rare.
It's that if it bleeds, it leads mentality.
Exactly. This can create a distorted perception of risk where we overestimate the likelihood of rare occurrences like terrorist attacks while underestimating more common dangers like car accidents or preventable diseases.
So we're afraid of the wrong things.
In a way, yes.
So how do we keep our fear instinct in check?
Rosling suggests grounding ourselves in facts, understanding the statistical likelihood of different threats.
So educate ourselves.
Yes, and he urges us to put risks in perspective by comparing them and focusing on addressing the most significant dangers, not the most sensationalized ones.
Don't let fear dictate your priorities or distort your understanding of true risks.
Exactly. He reminds us that the world in many ways is actually becoming safer. While challenges remain, violence, disease, and poverty are overall on a downward trend globally.
That's a message of hope, not complacency.
Exactly. It's about acknowledging the progress we've made while continuing to work toward addressing the remaining challenges.
One of the things that makes Factfulness such an engaging read is Rosling's use of personal anecdotes to illustrate these complex concepts.
He does. And those stories not only make the book more interesting, but they also provide valuable insights into the challenges and rewards of working to improve global health and well-being.
One story that really stuck with me was Rosling's experience in a remote village in Mozambique. He was investigating an outbreak of a paralytic disease called Konzo.
This disease was causing severe disability in the village, and Rosling was determined to find the cause.
He suspected that the villagers were eating something new that was causing the illness.
He spent weeks interviewing the villagers, collecting food samples, and analyzing the data.
But the mystery deepened when he discovered that the villagers hadn't introduced any new foods into their diet.
They were eating the same foods they had always eaten: cassava, beans, and maize.
So what was causing the paralysis?
Rosling eventually discovered that the villagers were eating the cassava in a different way.
Due to a poor harvest, they were eating the cassava roots raw without processing them properly.
And this was causing a buildup of cyanide in their bodies, which was leading to the paralysis.
It was a simple explanation, but it had devastating consequences.
It did, and it highlighted the importance of understanding the cultural context and the economic pressures that can influence people's behavior.
Another story that Rosling shares is his experience working in a hospital in rural Tanzania. He was treating a young boy who was severely malnourished.
The boy's family was poor, and they couldn't afford to buy him the food he needed to recover.
Rosalind was deeply affected by the boy's suffering, and he felt a sense of helplessness.
He knew that the boy needed more than just medical care. He needed food, clean water, and a safe place to live.
And he realized that these basic needs were not being met for millions of children around the world.
This experience had a profound impact on Rosling, and it inspired him to dedicate his life to improving global health and well-being.
He went on to co-found the Gapminder Foundation, which uses data and storytelling to promote a fact-based worldview and to inspire action on global issues.
Rosling's work has had a significant impact on the way we understand the world.
He has challenged our assumptions, dispelled myths, and inspired millions of people to see the world with fresh eyes.
And he has shown us that a fact-based worldview is not only more accurate, but it's also more hopeful.
Rosling argues that we are living in a time of unprecedented progress.
Global poverty is declining, life expectancy is increasing, and more children than ever before are surviving to adulthood.
And these achievements are the result of human ingenuity, innovation, and cooperation.
Rosling believes that we have the potential to continue making progress and to create a better future for all.
But to do so, we need to embrace a fact-based worldview.
We need to challenge our assumptions, be open to different perspectives, and base our decisions on evidence, not fear.
Another powerful anecdote that Rosling shares is his experience lecturing at Karolinska Institute, a prestigious medical university in Sweden. He was discussing the challenges of global health and the lack of research funding for diseases that primarily affect the poorest populations.
During the lecture, a student became visibly agitated and exclaimed, "Let's punch them in the face."
Rosling, surprised by the student's outbursts, tried to understand the source of his anger.
The student was clearly passionate about global health, but his anger was misplaced.
He was blaming the pharmaceutical companies for not doing enough to address these neglected diseases.
Rosling, who had experience working with pharmaceutical companies, challenged the student's simplistic view.
He explained that the situation was far more complex than the student realized.
He pointed out that developing new drugs is an incredibly expensive and risky undertaking.
And that pharmaceutical companies are businesses, not charities. They need to make a profit to survive.
Rosling argued that instead of blaming the pharmaceutical companies, we should be working to create incentives for them to invest in research on neglected diseases.
And he suggested that governments and philanthropic organizations could play a role in providing funding and support for such research.
It was a nuanced perspective that challenged the student's black and white thinking.
And it highlighted the importance of understanding the complexities of global issues before jumping to conclusions or assigning blame.
Another example of Rosling's ability to challenge assumptions and promote a fact-based worldview is his approach to climate change.
This is a highly charged issue, and it's easy to get caught up in the rhetoric and the fear-mongering.
But Rosling took a data-driven approach, looking at the long-term trends in global emissions and the factors that contribute to climate change.
He acknowledged the seriousness of the issue and the need for urgent action.
But he also cautioned against simplistic solutions and the blame game.
He pointed out that the majority of the carbon dioxide currently in the atmosphere was emitted by developed countries during their industrialization.
And he argued that developing countries should not be denied the opportunity to develop and improve their living standards.
Instead, he advocated for a global approach to reducing emissions, with developed countries taking the lead and providing financial and technological assistance to developing countries.
It was a balanced and pragmatic perspective that recognized the complexities of the issue and the need for shared responsibility.
Another important concept in factfulness is the idea of the urgency instinct.
This is the tendency to react impulsively to perceived threats, often without considering the full context or the potential downsides.
It's like that urge to implement a quick fix for poverty or hunger, without thinking about long-term sustainability or potential negative consequences.
Rosling emphasizes the importance of a data-driven approach. We need to analyze trends, understand the intricacies of issues before jumping to solutions.
He advocates for patience and a long-term perspective, recognizing that progress takes time. Sustainable solutions often require careful planning and implementation.
He shares his own experience with Konzo, the paralytic disease he studied in Mozambique. After identifying the cause as improperly processed cassava, he was eager to implement a solution.
He wanted to educate the villagers about the dangers and encourage them to return to their traditional methods of processing cassava.
However, he quickly realized that providing information wasn't enough. The villagers faced immense economic pressure to sell their processed cassava and needed practical solutions that addressed their immediate needs.
He had to adjust his approach and work with the villagers to develop a sustainable solution that addressed both their health and economic realities.
This underscores the importance of understanding the complexities of situations and collaborating with those affected to develop effective and sustainable solutions.
Rosling also cautions against the single perspective instinct, this tendency to view problems through a limited lens, often shaped by our own ideology or personal experiences.
This can lead to biased decision-making and a failure to consider the full range of potential solutions. We can get trapped in our own echo chambers, surrounded by people who share our views and fail to see the world through different lenses.
He tells a story about attending a conference in Cuba, where he presented data showcasing Cuba's impressive health outcomes despite its low income. The Cuban Minister of Health proudly declared Cubans as the healthiest of the poor.
It was a statement that reflected the Cuban government's emphasis on universal health care.
But later, an African woman challenged Rosling's interpretation of the data. She argued that being the healthiest of the poor wasn't something to celebrate. She believed Cubans deserved to be as wealthy and as free as people in other healthy nations.
It was a powerful reminder that there are always multiple perspectives on any issue. Our viewpoints can be limited by our own experiences and biases.
So how do we combat this single perspective instinct?
Rosling suggests starting with humility. We must recognize that we don't have all the answers and that our perspectives are limited. We must be open to learning from others, actively seeking out diverse viewpoints. Talk to people who disagree with you. Read information from sources that challenge your worldview and expose yourself to different cultures and experiences.
It's about expanding our horizons and challenging our own echo chambers.
Exactly. And be aware of your own biases. We all have them. It's crucial to recognize how they might be influencing our thinking.
It's about being self-aware and consistently questioning our own assumptions.
It was a powerful reminder that there are always multiple perspectives on any issue. Our viewpoints can be limited by our own experiences and biases.
So how do we combat this single perspective instinct?
Rosling suggests starting with humility. We must recognize that we don't have all the answers and that our perspectives are limited. We must be open to learning from others, actively seeking out diverse viewpoints. Talk to people who disagree with you. Read information from sources that challenge your worldview and expose yourself to different cultures and experiences.
It's about expanding our horizons and challenging our own echo chambers.
Exactly. And be aware of your own biases. We all have them. It's crucial to recognize how they might be influencing our thinking.
It's about being self-aware and consistently questioning our own assumptions.
Now let's discuss another instinct that can lead us astray, the blame instinct. This tendency to point fingers and assign fault can actually hinder us from finding effective solutions and perpetuate harmful stereotypes.
It's often easier to find someone to blame than to grapple with the complexity of a problem.
Precisely. Rosling highlights the common tendency to blame parents in developing countries for having too many children.
It's a misconception that overpopulation is the root cause of poverty and environmental issues.
It is. Rosling argues that this simplistic blame game ignores the underlying factors that drive high birth rates in poorer countries.
Factors like high child mortality rates, lack of access to education and family planning, and the need for children to contribute to family income.
Exactly. He points out that as countries develop and child mortality rates decline, families naturally choose to have fewer children.
This demographic transition is often accompanied by improvements in education, healthcare, and economic opportunities.
It is. So it's not about blaming parents, but about addressing the underlying social and economic factors that contribute to high birth rates.
Rosling also cautions against blaming individuals or groups for climate change.
This is a complex issue with multiple contributing factors.
It is. He argues that focusing blame on individuals can distract us from the need for systemic solutions.
It's not about individual choices as much as it's about transforming energy systems, reducing deforestation, and promoting sustainable consumption patterns.
Exactly. He emphasizes the need for collective action and global cooperation to address climate change effectively.
And he reminds us that while the challenge is daunting, it's not insurmountable.
It's about channeling our energy and resources into finding solutions rather than getting bogged down in blame and despair.
Now let's turn to the fear instinct, which can cloud our judgment and distort our understanding of risk.
Our brains are wired to respond to perceived threats, even if those threats are statistically unlikely.
Precisely. And the media often exploits this, highlighting dramatic and frightening events, even if those events are relatively rare.
Think about our fear of terrorism, even though statistically we're far more likely to die in a car accident.
It's the if it bleeds, it leads mentality.
Yes, and this can lead to a distorted perception of risk. We may overestimate the likelihood of unlikely events like terrorist attacks and underestimate the dangers of more common threats like car accidents or preventable diseases. So how do we keep our fear instinct in check?
Rosling suggests several strategies. First, ground yourself in facts. Understand the actual statistical likelihood of different threats.
Don't rely on gut feelings or anecdotal evidence.
Exactly. Second, put risks in perspective. Compare the likelihood of different threats and focus on addressing the most significant risks, not just the most frightening ones.
Don't let fear dictate your priorities.
And finally, remember that the world is actually getting safer in many ways. While there are certainly real threats and challenges, overall violence, disease, and poverty are declining globally.
It's a message of hope, not complacency. We can acknowledge the progress that's been made while still working to address the remaining challenges.
Precisely.
So what are some of the key takeaways from Factfulness? What can our listeners do to apply these ideas in their own lives?
Well, I think one of the most important takeaways is that we need to be aware of the dramatic instincts that can distort our perception of reality. We need to question our assumptions, be critical of the information we consume, and be open to different perspectives.
It's about becoming more conscious of our own biases.
Exactly. And we need to embrace a fact-based worldview. That means basing our decisions on evidence, not on fear or gut feelings.
It's about being more data-driven.
Yes. And it's about recognizing that the world is a complex place. There are rarely simple answers or easy solutions.
We need to be comfortable with nuance and ambiguity.
Exactly. And finally, I think it's important to remember that progress is possible. Rosling's book is full of examples of how the world has improved in recent decades, and those improvements are the result of human ingenuity, innovation, and cooperation.
So we have reason to be hopeful about the future.
We do. We have the power to create a better world, but we need to do it with our eyes wide open based on facts, not fear.
That's a great message to end on. So to our listeners, we encourage you to pick up a copy of Factfulness and see the world through a new lens. Challenge your assumptions, embrace the data, and join the movement for a more fact-based world.